Hey everybody, some cool chill music for our intro for this Friday afternoon. Hi, I'm Dan English. I'm the program coordinator for the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network at the Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative. If this is your first time watching, our organization's aim is to be honest brokers of policy relevant science here in Missouri. And that's kind of where the Local Science Engagement Network comes through for that. We're trying to reach scientists here in Missouri who maybe want to get more involved in the policy making discussion. We have an event I want to alert everybody to. Part of our mission is to write science notes for state and local lawmakers. So we have a workshop coming up for that, where you can learn to write science notes, and we can help you share them. If you give me a moment, I will copy and paste a link to that into the chat for everybody. And boom, there you go. So if that kind of workshop appeals to you, then by all means sign up. Let me bring in one of our esteemed guests, our co-host, Cynthia Chapel from Black Girls Do STEM. Cynthia, hello there.
Hey, how are you? Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be co-hosting this excellent panel discussion today. And I'm ready for the audience to get all of this knowledge that we're about to share.
Yeah. Cynthia, do you want to give your Black Girls Do STEM a plug? Okay, let me put the website up on the screen for everybody.
So I'm Cynthia Chapel, founder, managing director of Black Girls to STEM. We're an organization serving middle school and high school Black girls in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where we have a STEM Saturday Community Academy, and we also work with some awesome school partners here in the region locally. So check out our website at bgdstem.com. We're always looking for volunteers, partners, and always looking for folks to make a donation to our work, as well as continue to support us in community and share our information abroad. So thank you. And I'm, again, very excited to be here with Dan today, with most, to have this really engaging conversation.
Very good, very good. So I did put a link to your website into the chat. So make sure, if you're interested in that you do click on that. I'm gonna let our experts go over this, but right now I'm just gonna give us a 10,000 foot view. Let me pull up my script here. PFAS are a family of chemicals made of long-string carbon atoms with a fluorine on the end of them. Now the fluorine slash carbon bond is one of the strongest bonds there is in chemistry. So it takes a lot of energy to break them apart. That's why they're called forever chemicals. This graphic comes to us from the Missouri DNR by way of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. It illustrates kind of where PFAS can come from. They can come from industrial processes, are big sources of PFAS. They can come from landfills, from things that we throw away. It can come from household products like different food wrappers or fast food wrappers, or even your clothing sometimes when you wash it. PFAS from there can sometimes get into the groundwater. It can sometimes get into surface waters where we might be able to come more into contact. We'll get in touch with more of these sources later. If you have any questions, like I said, make sure you write them into the chat box, into the comment section down below. But one by one, Cynthia, let's introduce our guests. First, to my right is Dr. James Baskin from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Dr. Baskin, how are you doing today?
Just fine, thanks, Dan.
All right. We're going to add in Rebecca Eicher from AAAS, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. She is, I can't remember if you're a researcher at the Epicenter.
I'm a project director, so more in the science policy space.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit about the Epicenter before we get started?
Sure. So the Epicenter, or the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, is a program about 2.5 years old at AAAS. And the mission of the Epicenter is to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. So we're really looking to work with local, state, regional, and federal decision makers to help bring scientific evidence into the policy discussion. And PFAS are one of the topics that we're working on.
Rebecca, I'm going to put a link to the Epicenter down into the chat for everybody. Let's come back clockwise here, and we have Dr. Libby Davis from Butler University in Indianapolis. We're not just Missouri, we're all through the Midwest, and so that includes Indiana too. Libby, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing very well. I'm really pleased to be part of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, too bad he doesn't have a camera, so we can't see his beautiful face, but we do have Eric Medlock from the Missouri DNR. Eric, how are you today?
Doing great. Thank you, everyone, and glad to be here today.
All right, that sounds good. Cynthia, do you want to help me kick this off, and maybe we can get to some of the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again to our experts for being with us today. So we're going to talk about PFAS. And so we want to really help the audience start by understanding just generally what are PFAS. So I'm going to start with Dr. Hart. And Dr. Davis, with this question. There's a lot of research focused on PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. So with someone without a chemistry background, can you just give a basic level of understanding of what are PFAS and why should we worry about them, and also help us unpack this language of it being a forever chemical?
Yeah, certainly. So PFAS are a class of man-made chemicals. There are some organofluorine chemicals that occur in in nature, but we're not talking about that group right now. So these chemicals are exclusively synthesized, and it's a really big group of molecules. So the number that gets used is sort of 4,700 different molecules that you'll see tossed around are in this big umbrella of PFAS. I've actually seen more recently, the EPA actually included 9,000 chemicals under this list, and they're not all intentionally produced, which is one of the important things about them. Many of them are unintentional byproducts of the synthesis process. And what they are is a chain of carbon atoms. One of the cool things from a chemist's perspective is that carbon has a really remarkable tendency to form long chains with itself, and this is the basis of many life molecules. But typically those long chains of carbon are covered with hydrogen atoms. It's unusual that in this case, because of the synthetic advancements, these chemicals are fully covered in fluorine atoms. So there's 2 to 3 fluorine atoms on each of those carbons in that link. The link can be, the chain can be different lengths, but it's fully covered in fluorine atoms. That's significant because, as Dan said at the intro, there is not much in chemistry stronger than that carbon-fluorine bond. It takes a lot of energy to overwhelm that bond between those atoms. So essentially, a carbon-fluorine bond, once made, is with us forever. That's where the name forever chemicals comes from. The amount of time that it takes for them to break down is very long.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mr. Medlock, I want to bring you and some of your research into this, because after that description of PFAS, I want to figure out, what in your research, where have you seen PFAS and other forever chemicals around the state?
Sure. Let me share my screen here.
And I'll get that popped up.
Okay.
There we go.
And I'll zoom in on this for right now. It's more of a graphical representation so that everybody can kind of see what I'm going to be discussing. Then I'll zoom in on some of these other areas that you probably can't read right now. The blue dots on this map represent sites that were tested under the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. That is an occurrence study that EPA does once every 5 years, where they look at 30 unregulated contaminants, and PFOA, PFOS, and 4 other PFAS chemicals were part of those 30 analytes that they were monitoring for. Every public water system over 10,000 in population across the nation is required to sample, along with a subset of 800 smaller systems across the nation. So all the blue dots that are on this map represent the water systems in Missouri that tested under UCMR 3. Just quickly, there are some green dots and yellow dots on this map as well. After UCMR 3, we did a contract with the University of Missouri Science and Technology, MOS&T, for areas that had potential sites that were in potential areas of contamination, such as near airports where the AFFF or aqueous firefighting foam had been used. That's a known source of PFAS contamination. There's 3M manufacturing facilities that were in Missouri that were tested in those public water systems, and then other areas, fire stations that might have used some firefighting materials, as well as other industrial areas. So there were 15 systems that were sampled in 2016 and 2017. And then since that period of time, the Department of Defense has done a nationwide study on their facilities, and in areas like Fort Leonard Wood, the Whiteman Air Force Base, Richards-Gebauer Airport, which is south of Kansas City, Rosecrans Army National Guard, Lambert Air National Guard in St. Louis. Those sample test sites have been tested. And then I'll talk about this red dot here in the city of Farmington kind of last. But going back to UCMR 3, the detection levels at that time in 2013 to 2015 for the PFAS analytes were at 20 and 40 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS respectively. That's a very small level comparatively to other regulated contaminants. And at that time, EPA had established a provisional health advisory for PFOA and PFOS at 400 and 200 parts per trillion. So this was well below what they considered a health advisory level at that time. And through that study, what we found here in Missouri, there were absolutely no detects for PFAS here in Missouri. As a matter of fact, EPA Region 7, which encompasses the states of Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska, there was only one city in Kansas that actually had a detect under UCMR 3. And UCMR 3, as I mentioned, requires every large system over 10,000 to sample, as well as that smaller subset. And they have to sample if they're surface water quarterly for a year, and groundwater systems are required to sample twice in a year. So through that whole sample set, we were confident that there was not widespread PFAS contamination here in Missouri. However, doing our due diligence, because at the end of this study, it was found that states on the East Coast, West Coast, and then Michigan, Wisconsin, some of the northern states did have some levels that were well in excess of even the provisional health advisory level. So we contracted, like I mentioned, with Missouri Science and Technology. And let me see if I can get this to zoom in, and it's not allowing me. Dan, can you zoom this in on that table in the upper far right?
I'm afraid, yeah, I don't have that.
Oh, there we go.
Under control. There you go.
Just a little delay here. So these are all the samples that had detections and are noteworthy under those 15 samples that were systems that were sampled. And one of the things that really caught our attention is these were the potential areas that we thought might have some contamination, and indeed, using a research technology from Missouri Science and Technology, they were actually able to get the detection limit to a much lower level at 0.2 parts per trillion. So we did start detecting PFAS, PFOA and PFOS at some of these facilities. Interestingly, there was nothing over 2 parts per trillion. So again, even after EPA revised their health advisory level for PFOA and PFOS down to 70 parts per trillion for individual analytes or as a combined sum, none of these sites tested above 2 parts per trillion. So that was good. The other interesting thing that we found at that time is through conventional water treatment with surface water systems, they're required to make them bacteriologically safe when you're pulling water out of the river. You want to make sure that's bacteriologically safe, and you also want to make sure it's chemically safe. But even through all their treatment processes, there was little to no effect on PFAS. So if you had it in your raw water, you were having pretty much the same level in your finished water coming out the back end being served to the public. So that was one of the early studies that we had that showed and confirmed some of the more recent research. There is some technology, which we can talk about later, that is showing promise for removal. But again, no magic bullet with over the 3,000 or 4,000 or 9,000, depending on how many PFAS contaminants that are out there. Another interesting part, as I'll zoom in here on Sedalia, they were no detect for all but one sample in a finished water sample. And with what Dan went over at the beginning, PFAS can be found in many, many different things, not just in water, but it's been used in food wrappers, microwave popcorn, pizza boxes, where have you ever wondered why the grease from the butter or the grease from pizza doesn't just leak immediately through that box or that wrapper? Several of those have been treated with PFAS contaminants. So it can be found on new clothes. If you've ever dropped a bead of water on new clothing, it'll kind of bead up instead of just immediately soaking in. Good chance those have been treated with some type of PFAS chemical. Scotch Guard, other carbon fiber type material to keep them stain resistant, and water repellent have been treated with PFAS chemicals. So it's all around us in the environment. And so through the Sedalia sample, what we didn't know, and still may not be for sure, was that something that was brought in through the treatment process and one of their chemicals, or was it something with a sample error, with the sampler possibly eating something that had contaminated him before he actually took that sample? So just a few interesting things that we did find that from that MOS&T study. Kind of zooming back out here, as I mentioned, the Defense Site Restoration Unit, as part of our environmental remediation program, has data on some of those defense sites. And these are some of the highest levels that we've seen in Missouri. So we were not naive going in here in the recent years, knowing that even though Missouri did not show widespread contamination, through the UCMR study that we weren't going to have some isolated instances. And one of the highest areas that we've seen is the Richard Bauer Airport there south of Kansas City. It's at least 8 miles from any public water system, but in the shallow groundwater that they were testing there were some levels that were 300,000 parts per trillion. So we know there are some high areas that can happen. And then when we focus back down here on Farmington, Ozark Steel Fabricators and Siegel Roberts Global were in an industrial park there in Farmington. Ozark Steel Fabricators actually lost the ability to use their well when it was discovered that Siegel Roberts was part of our Brownfields voluntary cleanup program for some chrome plating that they were doing there. And in that process, and when PFAS was first starting to be discussed, we had them sample for PFAS and found that they did had used that in part of the process, and some of that had spilled offsite and actually contaminated the Ozark Steel Fabricators well. Fortunately, the city of Farmington had a municipal water line right there in the front of Ozark Steel's property, so they were able to discontinue the use of their shallow well and hook onto the city water from Farmington that has a well relatively nearby as well, but it's drilled to a much deeper depth. And that's one thing that we have seen here in Missouri with the different barriers of protection. You start out with the best source water possible. We have well construction standards to make sure wells are cased to an appropriate depth. We have certification, operator certification that requires training of our certified operators. So we have a lot of barriers of protection to this, and so far we have not seen anything else in the state of Missouri that has even remotely come close as far as a public drinking water well to the health advisory currently set at 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. We do know that EPA, through that study of UCMR 3, made the regulatory determination to regulate PFOA and PFOS. And that is anticipated to come out at the end of this year as far as what levels or more guidance as far as what they are looking at to incorporate that into a rule that Missouri will adopt since we have primacy over those requirements and regulations. With that, I will mention that a lot of these blue dots that are shown here will also be tested again for PFAS in 2023 through 2025 as part of UCMR 5. Congress passed the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which requires UCMR study to include any unknown PFAS analytes and methods that are available at the time. So right now there's 2 drinking water methods for testing, which captures 29 analytes. So we know that will be being done in UCMR 5 in the next study. Detection limits for that will be at a much lower level. So we are anticipating that we will have a lot more detects during that study. We also received some grant money from EPA. So this next year in 2022, just prior to UCMR kicking off, we identified population centers of 2,000 to 3,300. And the reason that population center was selected is as part of that NDAA that Congress passed, depending on EPA funding, EPA will now be required to sample down to populations of 3,300 and above instead of just 10,000 and above. So we believe that the EPA will be funded for that. So we're looking at the systems that would not be funded or sampled under UCMR 5. And we have enough funding in this coming year that we'll be able to sample all the blue dots on this map. The other thing that we know is that, as I mentioned, conventional water treatment does not break down PFAS. We also know that conventional wastewater treatment does not break down PFAS, and it can actually be concentrated in the process. So as people flush things, as people wash their clothes, it comes off the clothing and gets concentrated in the waste stream of wastewater treatments. The outfalls can actually concentrate that, and if there's a public water system nearby with that, it can actually pick up that PFAS that way. Some of the wastewater treatment plants also do biosolid application. So they're basically moving PFAS from the treatment of the wastewater plant and spreading it over fields. Another issue is landfills and the leachate. So as people discard their carpeting and other things that have been treated with PFAS, it does not break down, but it will get concentrated in that leachate. So the yellow triangles on this map represent known landfills that are around the state. And so our focus will be from this map, the systems that are 2,000 to 3,300 in population. Assuming there's still some additional funding available, we looked at systems that are 1,000 to 2,000 in relation to some of these sites, and should be able to incorporate some of these, as well as focus in on anything even smaller around these specific landfill areas. So with that, that's kind of what we've seen through some of the studies here in Missouri, but I will turn this back over to the experts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eric. I want to get a chemist here involved, Dr. Bashkin from University of Missouri, St. Louis. You're a chemistry professor here in Missouri. Give us some of the chemical background. What makes PFAS? What are they good for? And if anybody's worried about these, is there a better alternative to using PFAS?
Well, there are fortunately and unfortunately a lot of things that PFAS are good for, and many of these applications come in the medical area. So, for example, oxygen has a very high solubility in some perfluoroalkanes, and so for infants who have badly developed lungs, oxygen is dissolved in PFAS liquids and delivered directly to the lungs of infants to help them breathe. So they're actually breathing not air, but liquid PFAS filled with oxygen. And one of the reasons this is so good is that the PFAS doesn't stick to the tissue. So there's no damage to the tissue caused by the PFAS. And at the same time, there are a lot of medical devices that are made, like valves, heart valves, and things like that, that contain components that are derived from PFAS, especially because blood vessels don't clot on the PFAS components. PFAS are also used in the electronics industry, both as solvents and as other components. And so the cell phones and computers that we've become so accustomed to are highly dependent on using these kinds of chemicals. But not all of the uses are essential, such as the stain resistance and things like that. They're modern conveniences that we could probably do without, and we don't necessarily have good alternatives at the moment, but certainly I'm sure people are working on them. Now, one of the big areas where we need replacements is in the firefighting area at airports, but we seem to be sort of behind in that. In fact, just 2 days ago, I received an email pointing out a competition for new ideas for the Department of Defense to come up with firefighting foams to replace PFAS-derived foams, which seems kind of late. I mean, better late than never, of course, but I would have thought that these things would have been announced, such competitions would have been announced quite a while ago. So recently, the state of Maine announced that it was banning PFAS materials, but they have a clause that says that if these materials are essential, then the manufacturers can make an argument, and then they'll make exceptions for those essential materials.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. That was a lot of information. My background as well is in industrial chemistry in the coatings industry. So definitely understanding the application of looking for replacements to some of these environmental hazards. So we want to move along and jump to the EPI Center at AAAS and talk about the resources related to PFAS. What are some of the trends that you're seeing across the country? How much testing is really being done? And do we find these chemicals everywhere? I think we've talked a little bit about that, but can you speak specifically just to the resources being offered at the EPI Center with AAAS?
Sure. So far everyone has done a fantastic job of kind of talking about why PFAS are so effective and what they do for us. The Epicenter has created actually a couple of fact sheets around PFAS, as well as a guide that's really designed for local and state decision makers to give them an introduction to the science around PFAS. So really what decision makers need to know from a chemistry perspective, all the way to a little bit about the policy landscape that Eric did such a great job kind of outlining. I think the important thing to highlight again is that without a federally enforceable drinking water standard, states and local communities are looking at what they need to do to protect their drinking water. And that's really why we created these guides, to be able to provide that scientific overview, then a bit about the sampling. So if you are thinking about whether your drinking water has PFAS in it, really the only way to know is to begin to test and sample. So we have some information about sampling and monitoring. Then also a bit about treatment and mitigation. So I see there's actually a question about how do we get PFAS out of the water? So conventional approaches for treating drinking water don't work, but there are some processes that drinking water producers have been using, and things like reverse osmosis, GAC, or the granular activated carbon, they remove some PFAS, but as we need to remember, there are thousands of these compounds and we're working on them one by one. So it's a really challenging area in trying to develop standards around their human health effects, as well as treatment and what works. So you really need to know what you have in your drinking water to then identify how you can remove or treat the drinking water. And in terms of testing and kind of what's happening out there, as I said, without a federally enforceable drinking water standard, a lot of states have started to do their own process around setting standards at the state level and exploring what type of sampling needs to happen throughout their communities.
Good information. Thank you to our question asker from YouTube. It's a really good question. Let's get into some of the human environmental aspects of PFAS. And this question really goes out to anybody, but it's evident from Missouri DNR findings a few minutes ago that PFAS aren't really found in high concentrations around the strait. But I mean, I guess this is an equity question. In your research, is there anything that you've seen? Are PFAS more found in some areas? I'm thinking about in some marginalized groups. Do we find more PFAS chemicals? Say in poorer areas?
So I can speak a little bit about this. I'm not a researcher in this space and I'm not an expert, but I have had hosted some webinars similar to this with some folks who are really working in this space. And what we find is that exposure to PFAS can happen in any community. The challenge that arises is around the other inequities that communities face. And so as you're thinking about treatment of drinking water, who deals with that? Who pays for it? How do you provide bottled water? How do you, really do the treatment that's needed, and where does that money come from? So that's one space in which you can start to see inequities would develop. Secondly, as it interacts with other issues, you can see that there are inequities in how we handle environmental contaminants across the board. And they interact with health disparities and health inequities. We've seen it with COVID-19. We can see it again with PFAS. So there are a lot of ways that the exposure may be similar for communities, but then the after exposure is where you start to see the inequities come in. And how do you deal with it? Private drinking water wells are a big question. So we talk about sampling, but that happens really for community water systems. But if you're on a private well, usually you're responsible for testing your drinking water. So how do you figure out as an individual if you have PFAS in your well, and then what if you do find it? So there are a lot of interacting factors here. Additionally, I think some folks mentioned that it can be found in food wrappers. So often fast food is lined with PFAS. And if you think about what's available to some lower socioeconomic communities, fast food is really the only option. So now their exposure might actually be higher through food packaging. So there's a lot of research yet to be done to understand, but what we're seeing is that there are some inequities that really do need to be focused on and addressed.
Yeah, thank you again for that. My next question, staying in this humans and the environment space, is can you explain more about some of the health outcomes we're seeing people who are exposed to the PFAS and PFOS, such as children, adults, seniors? Are we seeing it affect children in a different way than the adult population versus the older population? And anyone can take this question as well.
I can speak to that, I think. So I think one of the really important things that you pointed out is that you're very right to expect that responses to a contaminant would be different in a childhood population, an adult population, or a senior population. So I think that that's right on the money, thinking about how these things affect people differently based on age. Because one of the things that's really important to understand is that children aren't little adults. They are developing systems that are fully formed in an adult. So an exposure timed at a particular point in gestation, infancy, or early childhood might have a completely different effect than a dose of similar magnitude proportionally to you or me. So I think it's important to note that things like in scientific studies, there's evidence of pregnancy-induced hypertension being related to mom's exposure to PFAS. There's evidence, there's also strong evidence of lower birth weight and head size and other things related specifically to pre-birth exposure. It's difficult to get smoking gun evidence in these kinds of studies because of the nature of scientific research. You can do direct observational animal studies, you can do larger scale population studies. It's difficult for ethical reasons to get a clear answer, but the strong evidence suggests relationships with all different kinds of cancers. So testicular cancer, kidney cancer, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, as well as things like bone density disease. And so those might be things that you think about particularly affecting older populations where those disease states are already going to be more common. There's concern about the influence of PFAS on thyroid function, which again, depending on when in life we're talking about, will have very different implications because thyroid function is so connected to reproductive development and cognitive development. So thyroid disruption, hormonal changes, and things like that. We've also seen evidence for delayed puberty in children, decreased fertility, early menopause, all manner of things. Another one that's interesting to note is, particularly with the younger population, is the potential for PFAS to exhibit what's called immunotoxicity, or interfering with the immune system's natural response to threats, which may mean that childhood vaccine response is somewhat lower in cases where you have a higher body burden of PFAS.
Yeah, and I'll just add, that's a perfect little addition around questions of what that means for COVID-19 and the vaccination, and whether it has an impact on your vaccine, your immune response, and even questions around PFAS load and disease, the COVID response. So if you do get COVID, is it more severe if you have a higher PFAS load? So a lot of interacting health questions with exposure.
So
and it's partly for these reasons that the state of California has recently passed preliminary requirements that are 70 times lower than the EPA's requirements at 1 part per trillion instead of 70 parts per trillion for PFOS and PFAS.
So based on that, I have kind of a follow-up question. It's kind of maybe out of left field for some of our researchers here. Is there a safe level of PFAS in the water that we drink?
Well, we don't really know is the answer to that. And one of the reasons is that there's some, as has been mentioned, there's so many different chemicals we're really talking about that we need to talk about a specific chemical if we're going to talk about a safe level. And we still don't have enough information even about the two main chemicals, perfluorooctanoic acid and perfluorooctanesulfonic acid, to give complete information about the safe levels for those. But the answer may be no, there isn't, or it may be that it's below 1 part per trillion or thereabouts, and that's an incredibly tiny number. It's amazing that we can even measure amounts that in concentrations that small, but we can.
That's really interesting. Now, Eric Medlock, you mentioned down in Farmington how that business was able to switch to the city's water supply away from their well supply. So PFAS, I guess, in one sense mitigated maybe, but for someone at home, if they're worried about getting PFAS out of their drinking water, if they want to, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, but what can they do to lessen their exposure to some of these chemicals?
So this has already kind of been touched on a little, but there are so many different PFAS analytes, and depending on what is on the terminal ends or what makes up that compound can make a big difference on what type of treatment you would need to actually remove it. Some of the conventional water treatment systems do not always have GAC, the granular activated carbon. But for those that do, that has been shown to remove some of the PFAS analytes. So as far as a home or business, anything with some activated carbon filters could be helpful. But again, it depends on what PFAS contaminant that might be present, whether those would be successful or not. There's reverse osmosis, which typically takes out most everything, not everything, but most everything. So a combination of some of those treatment technologies may be sufficient to help remove some of those things. And this might be a good plug for EPA. On my screen, I don't know, Dan, if you can still share that. EPA does have a drinking water treatability database. And it's been updated recently to show that there's 37 per PFAS contaminants. That includes 11 new PFAS chemicals added in May of 2021 as part of this database for anyone that might have questions about some of the treatability of those compounds. Some of the others that we rely on for fact sheets and information that we deal with on a regular basis is the ITRC. They have a lot of good information on their website, as well as ECOS. that has done a white paper and other information as far as different states that have set PFAS standards. As was mentioned, it is kind of a challenge when you have states like New Jersey and New York that are right beside each other, where somebody might live in one state and work in the other state. When they go to work, they can get PFAS at a certain level, but when they go home, the same level they were getting where they were working is now considered a violation and not considered a healthy standard. So until we get a federally enforceable maximum contaminant level across the entire nation from EPA, I think you're going to see that with a lot of states and their state toxicologists coming up with different numbers. So each state may be regulating these contaminants differently.
Interesting. Rebecca Eicher from the Epicenter. You asked me to put your link in the chat for the Epicenter, and that's why I wanted to bring it up and show it on the screen here. What kind of information are we going to be able to find here?
Yeah, so Eric kind of shared precisely the types of resources that I use, the ITRC, ECOS white paper, and those are really great technical guidance documents with a lot of information. As we're talking with local elected leaders, thinking mayors, city council members, they may not have time or resources to spend going through really heavy technical documents, which is why we created these guides. So if you scroll down a little bit, you can see a little bit more about the guides, and really they're kind of divided up into 4 key pieces. The first is providing the scientific overview of PFAS in drinking water. The second is around sampling and monitoring. The third is around treatment and mitigation. And the fourth is around risk communication. So how do you talk about PFAS with your community? And we really see this as a way to help local and state elected officials really get a handle of this. And then if they find that they have PFAS in their drinking water, we have resources, and we suggest dive into ITRC's technical guidance documents. Really go into what's happening and what your state or local community can do. But this is a way to help people start their learning process so they don't feel so overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. The only other thing I would add about the treatment piece is that this is really a systems problem. So you can remove PFAS from drinking water, but you have not broken down the PFAS. You have removed it from the drinking water. So now you have it in a media, but what do you do with that? And that's a big question that we still don't have a good answer for, which is, do you put your filter in the landfill and then you've just cycled it into a new source? So those are the big questions that still remain. Can incineration actually destroy PFAS? Can it break that bond? A regular incineration facility does not go to a high enough temperature to do that. So there are studies really trying to understand how high and how long do you have to incinerate these compounds to actually break them apart and break them down. So, we can ask, how can I treat my drinking water? But it doesn't actually solve the problem of these compounds existing and being in our environment.
That segues me into another question that I didn't have planned for you. Dr. Bashkin, since you're a chemist, can you talk a little bit about why maybe some of these compounds are so hard to break apart? What is it about that fluorine-carbon bond that sticks them so tightly together?
Well, to discuss it really requires technical language, but main thing is that that's not as technical, I guess, is that the more fluorines there are on a carbon, the stronger the carbon-fluorine bond becomes. And so for the polyfluorinated compounds, they have the strongest carbon-fluorine bonds of all. So starting with the fact that the carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest carbon X single bond of that's known, that bond becomes even stronger when you have more than one fluorine on a carbon. And so the problem becomes very, very difficult to break the substance down. And then whenever you talk about a chemical reaction, you can't just think about the starting materials, you also have to think about the products. And so when we burn hydrocarbons, we make CO2 and water. And those are very stable products. And we don't have similar products to make when we, if we wanted to combust the polyfluorinated versions of hydrocarbons. There is no analog to CO2 and water. I mean, we could make CO2 with oxygen, but there's no good water analog because there's no hydrogen in the molecule. And so we can't make H2O. And so we end up having to generate fluorine radicals at very high temperatures, 1400 degrees C and above for perhaps indeterminate lengths of time. And that's a difficult process. And part of this is that there's an ionic character to the carbon-fluorine bonds, which makes them much stronger than carbon-hydrogen bonds, which are largely covalent in the language of chemistry.
Dr. Bashkin, I think you're giving us all nightmares of our time in organic chemistry classes. I want to go back to...
Yeah, some people really enjoyed that, but I know they're in the minority.
I just, before I let Cynthia ask the next question, I want to point out that I put something in the chat. Part of our mission as an organization is to make it easier for you, the scientist, to reach out to your elected officials and offer your expertise on science and chemistry like this. And so one of the ways we make that easy is by going to MissouriLSCN.quorum.us. In the chat, I put a link down there so anybody can get on there. You can figure out who your elected officials are and send them some of these materials from the epicenter. All it just takes is a click and let us know if they reach back out to you, and we can connect you with more resources to share with them from the Missouri DNR, from the epicenter, from anybody on this panel. We can even share this chat because I think it'll be really informative to help everybody kind of learn what some of these chemicals are, where they come from, and where they're going. With that good segue, I think that where we're going next with PFAS chemicals. Cynthia, do you want to take the next question?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is our last question of the discussion, and we'll take it back to sort of a national view with Rachel asking about, from a vantage point of Washington, D.C., are there any successful efforts to mitigate or mediate PFAS happening in the U.S. right now? I know you guys just spoke about how, we really don't have the systems level solution. And also, I guess a follow-up or second point to that, do you have any idea of how that is going to affect some of these industries in which PFAS are utilized within?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things to sort of highlight and see that are coming. Eric mentioned UCMR 5, so that's EPA's testing. So they're now going to be looking for 29 new PFAS in these public drinking water sources. So that is going to give us a lot more information. I think a number of states are really moving forward, doing good science to base their standards on that. So that's really helpful and helping the EPA as they're looking to set their primary drinking water standard for 2 PFAS. So that's PFOA and PFOS. I'm not as brave as Dr. Bashkin to actually say the chemical names, so I'll stick to the acronyms. But those are some ways that federal policy and state policies are moving forward. Michigan has really done a lot of sampling, testing, from their groundwater, soil, drinking water. So they're a real state to understand and use as a leader in how the state is responding. I think also one thing that we haven't yet mentioned is actually PFOA and PFOS have been phased out of manufacture in the US. So they are no longer manufactured here in the US. It was a voluntary program through the chemical manufacturing industry and EPA. They can still be manufactured in other parts of the world and imported in products that we use in the US, but that's an example of how we've worked with the chemical industry to phase out 2 of these compounds. But again, there are thousands. And so thinking about what that means, I think Dr. Bashkin mentioned essential uses. That's one way that we could really start to think about, do we need this particular PFAS for this particular use? Do I need my clothes that I'm wearing to work stain resistant? No, if I spill something on me, what's it matter? And we all work from home anyway. So what's the need for that stain resistance? Lowe's and Home Depot have voluntarily taken it out of carpets. So if you're going to buy carpet, those are options that don't contain any PFAS or are said to not contain PFAS. So those are kinds of places where I think we could really see some opportunity and think about essential uses and turning off the tap on these contaminants.
Thank you for that. Great response. Great response. I'll turn it back over to Dan to have the final notes to our panelists.
Right. I just want to remind everybody, and even our panelists here, we do host a Zoom after party, and I'll put the link to that here. Well, that's not the right link. Whoops. That's not the right link. We do like people to come by if you're available to attend, but we also understand, hey, it's Friday afternoon. Maybe you have things you want to get to. If you want to come by our Zoom after party and hear me talking about the Kansas City curling bonspiel ad nauseum tonight, then feel free to do so. The link is in the chat. We have maybe 2 minutes left. Are there any closing thoughts that anybody wants to leave us with? All right, and with that, I do have a favor to ask each of you who viewed the event. It's another link I'm posting in the chat. We do have a form we'd like everybody to fill out, just telling us, hey, what do you think about our programming like this? What can we do better next time? Let us know. And with that, I'm Dan English. That's Cynthia Chapel, Dr. James Bashkin from University of Missouri, St. Louis. Eric Medlock from the Missouri DNR.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Dr. Libby Davis from Butler.
Thanks so much.
Dr. Davis, Cynthia and I are both from Indiana, so we're happy to have Indiana people. Even I know you're not from Indiana, but
broadening the net. I like
broadening the, yeah. And all the way from Washington, D.C., Rebecca Eicher from AAAS.
Well, thank you, and thanks for letting me join the Midwest crew for a day.
Very good. All right. Thank you, everybody. If you'd like to show up to the Zoom after party, we're happy to have you. If not, we'll see you next month, okay? We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you. Are you going to the after party?
Sure, might as well.
I guess we got to switch over.
Yeah, we'll see you there.
All right. See ya.